Hi there, welcome back. So in this section, we're going to focus on something brand new. It's going to be a little bit of a side trip for a moment away from Node and Express and Yelp Camp and all of the stuff we've been covering. We're not even going to write JavaScript, HTML, or CSS for the next few videos. We're going to focus on something called Git. And most of you have probably heard of Git or come across it in some way. It's a very popular and important technology. But it's very different than what we've done so far. It's not really a full language. It's not something that is actually that complex. It is a little tricky to really master and to get going at the beginning, so I'm not trying to trivialize that at all. But it's not like learning JavaScript or learning all of CSS. The scope is much, much smaller. So as I mentioned, it is popular. I still haven't told you what it is really, but it is popular. I just read today that 42% of developers use it. I don't know if that's in the US or across the entire world, but 42% of some population of developers uses it, which is more than we can say about a lot of technologies. So what it is a version control system. So if I go to the official Git homepage, which is git-scm.com. It's not going to be all that illuminating up front, but what it tells us is that Git is a free and open source distributed version control system designed to handle everything from small to very large projects with speed and efficiency. So what is a version control system? Basically, it's a way for us to work with different versions of our code so that we can save different features and make notes as we progress and have different versions that we can move forwards and backwards through time. And then we can also collaborate with other people and incorporate different versions of some code that I wrote with code that my coworker wrote. So it's really powerful. I said a lot of developers use it. It's definitely important. You might be wondering why I waited until this point to teach it. And I've seen a lot of questions about that, people who are starting the course wondering when we cover Git. The reason that I didn't teach it up front, which I actually usually do historically, is I spend time teaching Git at the beginning. And we also start with a command line early on. There's a few reasons really. One is that it's not that exciting, and I didn't want to lose people's interest right at the beginning, especially in an online course where it's so easy to check out, to not pay attention, versus in an online or in an in-person class, I have you hostage for at least 45 minutes for a lecture where you have to try it. So I didn't want to discourage people early on. On top of that, it is something that requires the terminal. So you need to understand command line, and I didn't want to move command line to the beginning because then we have to talk about Cloud9 and installation, and I wanted just to keep it simple at the beginning. So those are two of the reasons. The third one that's most important is that it's really hard to understand the utility of Git, to really see why it makes sense when you're working by yourself and when you're just starting out. So I mentioned that it helps you save different versions, it helps you collaborate with people. If you have a huge project, it's really beneficial. But of course, at the beginning of this class, we don't have any huge projects. We're not collaborating with people. And even at this point, you're not necessarily collaborating. You're most likely learning on your own. So it's a little bit hard to really motivate why Git is all that useful. I can convince you that it's useful, but I don't think I would be able to get you to use it willingly and get you to want to use it until later in the course. So we're at that point now. We're covering Git. You've also probably heard of GitHub. If I go back here to our notes, these are the big things I want to talk about. So what is Git? What is GitHub? They're very different. They are related. Maybe very different is too strong of a word, but they're not the same thing. That's a really common misconception with beginners who just kind of lump them in together. Git is a technology. It's totally separate. GitHub is a website. It's an application that works with Git, but they're not the same thing at all. So I'm actually going to talk more about what GitHub is further down here. We can work with Git and not care about GitHub at all. And lots of people do that. They'll use Git, but they won't use GitHub. It's not that common, but it's possible. So we're going to focus on just Git at the beginning. So we talked about these two. Why you should care, again, is that it's really useful. So that's one thing. You will potentially use this a lot, especially if you end up working with people, whether it's as a contractor or you get a job as a developer. It's something that lots and lots of teams use. As I mentioned, 42% of developers so that's mainly why you should care. It's also one of those things that's just good to have on your resume. And it's actually not limited only to writing code. Initially, that was what it was kind of created for, but more recently, there's been other applications. So one of those that I want to talk about is using Git to help manage the process of writing a novel or a play or a screenplay. So imagine that you are a writer and you have some huge story that's in your head that you're going to sit down and write. And I don't know, I've tried writing a screenplay before. My process was very difficult, lots of revisions, lots of different drafts that I would save. And my process, much the same as my process for writing essays in college, was to write a version and save it as essay V1. And then if I wanted to make some other crazy change, or I decided I'm going to delete this entire paragraph and try something totally different, but I don't want to abandon what I had at the beginning, then I would use save as and make a copy and have essay V2. And every time I wanted to have sort of a checkpoint where I could go back, I could revert to my old draft, I could read what I used to have, I would create a new document and use save as and give it a new title and usually increment the numbers. And eventually I'd get something like this, essay, like final real version, pick this one, something ridiculous. Because my naming conventions, or wasn't really a convention, but my naming got out of hand. So that's the problem that Git solves, or one of the problems, is that with Git, what I can do is have one essay or one screenplay that I'm working on and use Git and basically tell Git to save my files to keep track of them. I still have to save the files in my text editor, but what I can do with Git is say, all right, at this point, save all these files, and I've just added in the death of the main character. And then I could write a little bit more and save again using Git and say that I've now just added in the death of the secondary character. And then I could change my mind and say maybe I should take the story in a different route. So then I could try something and save another version of it, not really a draft, but save another version where instead of killing off the two main characters, they both live and they get married and they have kids. And what I can do later on, if my editor gets the story and decides, you really should have killed them off, I can easily, just using a simple git command, I can say go back to the point where I saved it, where I said that I killed off the main character, or where I said, X or Y. Basically, you can leave little messages for yourself. And it's not only that, it's not limited to one file, which is something that's very different from traditional systems of managing your versions. So on an essay, it's one file that I'm working on, I save it, and then I might save as, but it's always one file. What you can do with Git is if you have a huge project, so going to code now, if we have a project with 10 JavaScript files, a bunch of CSS, some images, HTML, lots of different technologies, let's say it's an Express app that's lots of folders, what I can do is target individual pieces and save them using Git. So I can say, okay, I just created the views directory and added in the views for dogs. And I can save that as a checkpoint that I can come back to later. And then I could do something later on where I decide, okay, just remove the dogs from the views directory and instead move them into their own dogs directory inside of the views directory. And I can save that as a checkpoint. And then I could do that for all different pieces. So usually what you end up with is at the end of a project, you'll have lots and lots of different little commits, is what they're called. So I'm going to show you a quick example of that. And I am going to GitHub, which again is not the same as Git. Think of it as a viewer for Git, a way to share different versions of things, to share code with people. It's not Git itself though. So this is the Express repository on GitHub. And what I want to point out, so this is the code for Express that we've been using when we run npm install Express. this code is run. Well, it's not necessarily run when we install, but when we include Express and we execute it, then a lot of this code is run. What I want to show though is right here, 5,194 commits. So in the next video, we'll actually write our own commits, and I'll show you what that looks like and really what it means. But take a look at all these messages, and there's thousands of them. So let me just pick an arbitrary one here. Let's look at let's find, here we go. This is fine. Update example dependencies. If I click on that, what I see here are the files that were included in this commit. So the files that were basically targeted to be saved, to make a version of, a message that says update example dependencies, and I see what was changed. So we changed the versions, it looks like, or whoever wrote this, Doug Wilson, changed the versions. So that's a simple example of a commit. Let's see if we can try to find something a little bit more complex. All right, well, here's one with 2 files. So Express is probably 100 plus files across this entire repository. But in this case, someone made a small commit with 2 changes across 2 files. So that's just a few examples. Feel free to take a look. Obviously, you're not expected to understand the code or all the terminology, but take a look, and it's fun to go back to the very beginning. I actually don't know if there's a really easy way to do that, just to hop back to the very beginning, but you could try changing this to be page 50, and that takes you back to 2012. So that's all I'll show of Express. Again, we'll return to GitHub shortly, but we're going to start by talking about Git in our terminal, where we're just writing our own code and saving it at different places using Git to make our own commits, but we're not going to be sharing those with anyone until we talk about GitHub. So the last thing I want to mention is installing Git, and I have in parentheses, not really, and that's because using Cloud9, we don't have to install Git ourselves. It comes installed already when you make a new Cloud9 instance. But if you're not using Cloud9, if you're using a terminal, your own shell that you installed, you will have to install Git. So you can find plenty of instructions online. Occasionally things go wrong, you need some dependencies, but it's one of the most installed tools in all of web development. So there's lots of tutorials, resources, Stack Overflow posts everywhere. But using Cloud9, we don't have to worry about that. So just to make sure that it works, here's the test you can do. Git -- version. Whoops. And as long as you see something here, it doesn't have to be 1.9.1. If you're seeing this in the future and you have a different version there, that's fine. All that matters is that you don't see command not found. You don't see an error message. And that's all we're going to do with Git for now. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about 3 new commands: git init, git add, and git commit. All right, I'll see you in that lesson.